This morning, I like to, every morning, catch the 5 a.m. hour here on KCMO before we get on the air at 6. And we run the Fox News Rundown, which is a great show, of course, as a Fox News affiliate here on KCMO. And Gregg Jarrett, the legal and political analyst for Fox News, was on the show this morning talking about the intricacies of the O.J. Simpson trial. Of course, O.J. dying from cancer this week at the age of 76. And Gregg Jarrett now joins us on KCMO 95.7 FM and streaming on the KCMO Talk Radio app. Gregg, good morning. Thanks for being here. When you look back on that trial, you were covering it then, as you've noted. What was the biggest mistake that the prosecution made in hindsight 30 years later?
Well, it was Chris Darden's stupidity in having O.J. Simpson try on the gloves that were used during the murders. And the backstory behind that is that F. Lee Bailey, one of the greatest trial lawyers in American history, part of the defense team, had been sort of behind the scenes quietly taunting Darden. Oh, why don't you have O.J. try on the gloves? This will resolve the entire case. And over and over and over again, he taunted Darden, and Darden took the bait. And he had Simpson try on the bloody gloves. Well, Simpson stood there in front of the jury. Oh, gosh, I can't get him on. He struggled and, said they didn't fit. Well, the reason they didn't fit was because they'd shrunk. They were soaked with blood, and then in the laboratory, they were frozen and unfrozen and frozen and unfrozen, and during the process, they shrunk, as any fabric would. And, that, of course, led to the infamous line during closing arguments by Johnny Cochran, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit. I've covered hundreds of trials. I've tried many cases myself. In my 44 years as a lawyer, I've never seen such overwhelming evidence of guilt, and yet he got away with it.
Truly amazing. What about the location of the trial, being tried in downtown Los Angeles versus where the murders took place in Santa Monica? How did that come to be?
To me, the case stands as an example of our justice system is not perfect. It depends on people. People are fallible. They don't always get it right. And you're correct. The biggest mistake was when Gil Garcetti, the elected DA, moved the case from Santa Monica to downtown Los Angeles. He was so cocky that he thought it didn't matter. In fact, at one point he thought O.J. would simply plead guilty, in exchange for a life sentence instead of the death penalty. Well, I grew up in Los Angeles. I tried cases in L.A. I knew that downtown jurors distrusted cops, especially in 1995. It was just a couple of years after L.A. burned during the Rodney King riots. And, this was a cop case. So Johnny Cochran and his dream team argued that racist cops planted all of the evidence, which was utterly preposterous. But, the jury was predisposed to acquit, and all you had to do was give them an excuse. Even a ludicrous excuse.
When you look back on that time, Gregg Jarrett, Fox News legal analyst, is on KCMO Talk Radio. It's easy to look back now and talk about what you're talking about when it came to the role of the Rodney King riots. At that time, as a guy who knew L.A. as well as you did you realize this thing was doomed from the start, or did you still think the evidence was so overwhelming it would basically lead to a guilty verdict?
Well, there was a part of me that knew it was doomed. I was apoplectic, as a lawyer, that you got to be kidding me. You're taking this out of Santa Monica and moving it down to L.A. The reason Garcetti did that is, he wanted his office was in downtown, so he wanted to be available to the media at all times instead of trying the case in Santa Monica. It was insane. This is a case that should have taken no more than 6 weeks to try. if there had been a competent judge. But Lance Ito, who was eventually assigned the case, completely lost control of the courtroom and allowed the defense to commandeer the case with this ludicrous argument that racist cops planted all of the incriminating evidence. And, the prosecutors, Marcia Clark, Chris Darden, they're to blame as well. I mean, they thought the case was such a slam dunk that they didn't need to prepare their witnesses properly. And defense attorneys, they pushed the bounds of ethics by making these absurd claims that they knew to be untrue. And as I said, the jury was predisposed to acquit, despite the evidence, the obvious evidence, of guilt.
When you look back, you mentioned Johnny Cochran and that dream team that was put together. Was it really, did they win the case or did the prosecution blow the case, Gregg Jarrett?
Well, it was both. I knew Johnny Cochran after the slow-speed chase. I flew to Los Angeles, and the first person I called from the airport was Johnny Cochran, because I'd known him, and he was a prominent attorney. At this point, he wasn't a part of the defense team, so I went over to his office. I interviewed him about the case, and then I invited him to be my legal analyst guest every day during the preliminary hearing, which occurred very quickly. And he was. And he wasn't a part of the defense team. He knew O.J. Simpson. And during commercial breaks, I would occasionally ask him, have you talked to O.J.? Are you gonna go down and see him and maybe join the defense team? And, of course, he eventually did.
Do you think they could have? Do you think Johnny and that line, of course, if it doesn't fit, you must acquit? I mean, is that the brilliance of Johnny Cochran, whether you or we like the morality of what he did or not? I mean, did he ultimately get that thing done, or do you think that the rest of the group? I don't know if Robert Kardashian was there from the start. They could have won that without Johnny.
Robert's a really good lawyer, but Johnny Cochran was in a class of his own. One of the finest trial lawyers, in American history. He's right up there with F. Lee Bailey, who was also part of the defense team, and of course, in his heyday, Clarence Darrow. I wrote a book about Darrow recently. The evidence that Cochran had to get around was formidable. I mean, O.J. Simpson cut his finger when he stabbed his victims. His blood was at the murder scene. It was dripping along the path from the bodies to the back of the property where his Ford Bronco was parked. The victim's blood was all over the inside of Simpson's Bronco. It was on the socks found in his bedroom, on the fence outside his home. And, of course, during the struggle with Goldman, one of the gloves was left at the crime scene. The matching glove, soaked with their blood, was found on O.J.'s property. He managed to get rid of the rest of the evidence, but that was more than enough. And it was really quite brilliant for Johnny Cochran to be able to overcome all of that overwhelming evidence of guilt.
Is there anything, as you look back 30 years later, of course, O.J. dying this week, Gregg Jarrett, Fox News legal analyst on KCMO, that the history books have forgotten that we haven't touched on yet?
Well, when I think of O.J. Simpson, I don't really think of him so much as I think of his victims. And one of the haunting memories I have are the autopsy photos of the butchered and slaughtered bodies, particularly Nicole Brown Simpson. It was so vicious, he nearly decapitated her head. And I also remember the photographs of Nicole Brown Simpson having been beaten repeatedly and relentlessly by O.J. Simpson. Those photographs mostly came out in the civil case in which the jury out in the Brentwood, Santa Monica area found him liable to the tune of $33 million for killing them. And he had beaten her so often. She had gone to the hospital. She had called police. At one point in time, she, said she wanted to go into hiding because she knew O.J. was going to kill him. So when the death of O.J. Simpson, I don't think about him. I think about the lost precious lives of Ronald Goldman and Nicole Brown Simpson. They had so much to live for. And yet, this heinous man took their lives in the most vicious way.
Gregg Jarrett, a legal analyst, Fox News, doing great work, joining us here on a Friday on KCMO. Gregg, thank you so much for the time. We appreciate it, and we'll talk to you soon. Have a great day.
My pleasure. Thanks.
You bet. Gregg Jarrett on KCMO Talk Radio.